One Wintry Night, Part 2, read aloud by Granny Tice. The Man Who Listened, Chapter 6. "That ain't the end," the boy said hopefully as he smoothed the purring cat. "No," the woman smiled, "it's just the beginning. You see, God was determined to make a way for man to come back home. It happened like this. God still loved these people he had made, for he does not change. No matter how badly Adam and Eve had sinned, they were still his. So though he drove them from the garden, he continued to watch over them. Many years passed, and God kept watching over Adam and Eve. They had 2 sons, Cain and Abel. When these boys grew up, Cain killed Abel, his only brother. For the first time ever, Adam and Eve saw someone dead, and their own son at that. They wept till there were no tears left, and awoke the next day to weep again. They realized once more what a terrible thing it is to disobey God. Adam and Eve had more children, and those children had children until there were whole cities of people, and most of them acted as badly as Cain. God kept looking for someone who would listen to him and obey, someone to whom he could be a friend. But they didn't listen. Just as the first 2 people forgot about God, so did those who came after them. Instead of living in peace, they fought with each other. The soldier who killed the most people was the greatest hero. And when they weren't fighting, the children of Adam liked noisy pleasures. At their parties, they stuffed themselves, shouted, and drank far into the night. In all the noisy confusion, people did not hear the voice of God speaking to their hearts. No one heard him saying over and over that this was not the way to live, that this was not what he had created them for. God saw how wicked the people had become. Their thoughts were continually evil. It made him very angry. Grieving, he decided to wash mankind from the face of the earth so he could start all over again. In all that wickedness, one man stood out, for he was just and upright, a man who walked with God. His name was Noah. God decided to save Noah and his family from the flood that was coming. He told Noah to build an ark, a huge boat with many rooms inside. And God told him exactly how to build it. It would be big enough to hold Noah's whole family, plus some of every kind of animal and bird in the world. When Noah's neighbors saw him building a huge boat on dry land, many miles from the ocean, they laughed until their sides hurt and tears rolled down their cheeks. But Noah didn't care what people thought. He wanted only to obey God. After the last board was pegged in place, Noah and his 3 sons led the animals into the ark. His wife and his sons' wives carried in the food: seed for the birds, grain for the cattle and horses, dried fruit for themselves, enough to last for a long, long time. As Noah and his family and the animals waited inside the ark, Noah's neighbors laughed louder than ever. While they were laughing, the rain began to fall. Through the downpour, those in the ark heard a strange sound. The laughter had turned to wailing. Then the air was pierced with screams. Fists pounded on the outside of the ark. Noah and his family could do nothing, for God had shut them in. Soon the pounding stopped. Cries grew fewer, and then there was only the steady pouring of rain. Day and night the raging storm continued. In the flickering light of their oil lamps inside the ark, Noah's family sat and listened to the rain pounding on the roof. After many days, they felt the ark gently rocking, and they knew it was floating on the water. It rained for 40 days and 40 nights, When at last it stopped, Noah opened the window to look out. There was nothing but water, stretching as far as his eyes could see. Not even the mountain peaks showed. Several weeks passed while they floated on. The animals wished they could get out and run. The deer paced back and forth in their stalls. The ark began to smell as bad as a dirty barn on a hot August day. Noah and his family wondered if they would ever see dry land again. Then one day, Noah opened the window and lifted out a dove. The dove eagerly took to the skies. It flapped its wings and soared above the water until it was out of sight. Several hours later, the dove returned, holding an olive leaf in its beak. That made all the animals in the ark very happy because they knew the water must finally be going down. A whole year went by before the earth was dry enough to walk on. Then out of the ark they all tumbled, Noah and his family and all the animals. The cows kicked up their hooves and bounded across the hills as though spring had come after a long winter. Noah's family was so glad to get out of the crowded ark. They wanted to run and jump and turn cartwheels. But before he did anything else, Noah built an altar and offered a solemn prayer of thanks to God. God promised Noah and his family that he would never again destroy the earth with a flood. And he placed a rainbow in the sky as a sign that he would never forget his promise. At first, the people didn't forget either. Noah's sons remembered God and the great flood he had sent. They told their own sons and daughters about it, and the sons and daughters told their children, but it was starting to seem like a story from long, long ago. People could no longer recall exactly why Noah and his family were rescued from the flood. They forgot how important it was to listen to God. God intended for everyone to live together in peace, but people began once again to stray from his plan. If a man was strong, he would take all the wheat from his neighbor's fields and all the fruit from his trees and lock them up in his own storehouses. The strongest and richest declared themselves rulers, making whole cities their slaves. They invented many fake gods, a god to help them win wars, a god to make it rain, a god to chase wolves away. They even tried to imagine what these gods looked like. They carved them out of wood, stone, even metal. Watching the people, God saw they were getting more confused all the time. There is only one God, he kept trying to tell them. It was no use. They didn't hear him. Most people had ignored God for so long, they didn't even recognize his voice. God thought of another plan to rescue his people, a plan that would one day lead to that first Christmas in Bethlehem. To make the plan work, God needed someone who was still faithful to him, and he knew just where to find him. Chapter 7. The Chosen People. Abraham lived in a rich and beautiful city called Haran. He was one of the few people who still listened to God. One day he heard God's voice say, "Get out of your country to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Abraham was 75 years old. Leaving home was hard, but he obeyed God. Taking his whole family, he traveled by camelback to the new land. For many years, Abraham and his family lived in that country, which was called Canaan. Then, during the life of his grandson Jacob, also called Israel, there came a great famine. To find food, Israel and his children left their homes and moved south to Egypt. Here they settled. At first the Egyptians welcomed them, But after many years they turned against them and made them slaves. For hundreds of years the Israelites sweated and strained for the Egyptians. It seemed as if God had forgotten his promise to make them a great nation. Egypt was a rich nation. Its king, the Pharaoh, had more slaves and more gold than any other ruler. The Egyptians believed in many false gods and built huge temples for them. Many of the Israelite slaves began worshiping the idols of Egypt. All day the Israelites would slave in the mud pits, making bricks for the Egyptians. Then at night, while their masters were chanting and singing in the great temples, they went back to their tiny shacks. Those who still believed in the one true God prayed to him in whispers. God hears whispers just as well as shouts. He lives in slums as well as in palaces, and he heard the Israelites' desperate prayers for help. Even though these descendants of Noah had disappointed God, he still loved them. So once again, he prepared a leader to rescue his people. God found a faithful man named Moses and told him, "I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people out of Egypt." Moses knew Pharaoh would be furious when he heard the plan. After all, why should a king agree to let his valuable slaves go free? But Moses obeyed God. He went bravely to Pharaoh and said, "Thus says the Lord God of Israel, let my people go." As Moses expected, Pharaoh turned red with anger. "Who is this Lord," he roared, "that I should obey his voice to let Israel go?" In his fury, Pharaoh made the children of Israel work harder than ever. To make Pharaoh change his mind, God sent many plagues on Egypt. One was a plague of frogs, green, slimy frogs, thousands and thousands of them, covered the ground. They were everywhere the Egyptians stepped. Frogs hopped into their beds and jumped into the dough when the cooks tried to bake bread. The Egyptians prayed desperately to all their gods to take the frogs away. The sound of croaking only grew louder. At last, Pharaoh begged Moses to pray to his God. "If your God takes the frogs away," he promised, "I will let your people go." He was lying. When God took the frogs away, Pharaoh only laughed, and he didn't let the people go. So God sent more plagues to the Egyptians: gnats, flies, boils, hail, locusts. Everywhere people were itching and swatting and scratching and ducking hailstones. And they began to starve because the locust had eaten all the food. Now God told his own people how to survive the most dreadful plague of all. Each household was to get a perfect little lamb. When they had killed it, they were to put blood on each side of the door and on the top. God called this his Passover. For wherever he saw the blood, his destroyer would pass over that house. On that dark night, all the firstborn sons of the Egyptians died. Pharaoh was awakened by the terrible sound of weeping. His wife was holding their dead son. Through her tears, she glared at him accusingly. All over the land, as mothers discovered their dead sons, cries arose until all that could be heard was unbroken wailing. Now Pharaoh was truly terrified. He sent for Moses, then begged him to take his people and leave at once. So the children of Israel, well over 1 million of them, grabbed their belongings and hurried out of Egypt as fast as their legs could go. But once more, Pharaoh changed his mind. While the Israelites were resting at the edge of the Red Sea, Pharaoh and his army came chasing after them. The sea lay in front of the Israelites, and the dust cloud of Pharaoh's powerful army was quickly closing in from behind. They were trapped. Suddenly there came a mighty east wind. All that night God blew back the water of the sea until a dry path appeared right through the middle of it, with the water a wall on either side. The children of Israel hurried through the opening in the water. When the Egyptians tried to cross after them, the water rushed back in with a thunderous crash. Armor and chariots crashed and shattered. Horses reared, rolling their eyes and snorting in terror as they threw their riders. Then all fell silent, except for the lapping of the waves along the shore. Pharaoh's mighty army was never seen or heard from again. At last, the children of Israel were safe, and they were free to worship the one true God. On a mountaintop on the other side of the sea, God gave Moses the 10 Commandments and other laws to help his chosen people know how to live. In time, God led them to the land he had given Abraham many years before. It was to this land and among these people that God planned to send a Savior to rescue the human race once and for all. God had chosen the people and the place, but he was waiting for the right time. The grandfather clock struck 10. The woman looked up. The fire had dwindled to a heap of glowing coals. The boy was watching her with wide eyes, but there were shadows under them. "Well, I never!" she exclaimed. "Time crept up on us while we were in Egypt, I guess." "It's interesting," the boy protested. "It can wait until morning," the woman said. "Come, have a cup of hot milk and some pie, and then hit the hay." She set about getting the kitchen ready for the next morning. Meanwhile, the boy, with his sprained ankles soaking in the pan again, ate the pie and washed it down with warm milk. "Sleep well, Zeb," she said as he got up to go to the guest room. "Night, ma'am, and thank you for today."